Are back with part 3 of this week's reading of the Messianic Jewish Family Bible Tree of Life version, and we're doing the introduction to Judges in chapters 1 through 10. Now, when I said I was going to pause, I was actually going to pause, and I I hit the save button, which stopped part 2. So instead of redoing part 2, well, part 2 is just going to be much shorter than what these parts usually are. So we are actually back with part 3 now, because I'm not going to redo it. It's already done. Goes to show I'm a little tired here as I'm doing this, but that's okay. We're gonna complete this. Um, I just wanted to mention that God gave commands concerning the inhabitants of the promised land prior to B'nai Israel actually going into the promised land. He commanded Benaiah Israel to drive out the inhabitants completely, not to mix with heathen nations, not to marry with heathen nations, nor do anything that the heathen nations do, such as worshiping all the many gods. And he instructed them to keep all of his commandments and to worship only him and to love him, serve him with all of their heart, soul, and might, and to teach their children to do so and to teach them to love and obey God. They were to throw down the altars of the heathen nations because these altars were to false gods that the heathen nations worshipped. So what happened is they did not drive them all out, which, yes, he had already told them that would become a thorn in their side. And even when Joshua was alive, they were not driving out all of the inhabitants. So, Joshua dies in chapter 2. We talk about Joshua, who really was a good leader for Benaiah Israel, who followed Moses and was anointed actually. So he dies at the age of 110. They bury him in the borders of his inheritance in Timnath Heres, which is in the Mount of Ephraim on the north side of the hill Gash, Gaash. So, and then what happened is the generations of elders kept the covenant with God, but once those generations were passed on, B'nai Israel ended up doing evil in the sight of Adonai, and they ended up serving Balaam, which is they're serving Baal now in this day. So this is an ongoing issue, actually. Um, Somewhere along the line, a history had not been passed along to the new generations. So they had not been taught all of the good God had done for them, for their ancestors. And so they ended up doing evil and falling prey to the remnants of the inhabitants that were left in their land that should have been driven out as God had instructed them to do. So they fell into the ways of the world that were around them and began worshiping false gods, and they were not serving the one true and living God. So they lacked the knowledge of God and all that he had done for the nation of Israel. So unfortunately, and this reflects on us too, unfortunately not passing accurate history from one generation to the next shows how important life essentials can be lost. And this was a huge loss because Benaiah Israel forsook their relationship with the one true God, their God, because they lacked knowledge of him. And this is why it is important to pass on accurate history from one generation to the next and maintain the truth for future generations, because future generations will become lost and end up repeating the same mistakes of the past without even realizing it and end up getting way off track. Passing on the truth about God and the truth about God's word is very important. Many have not had this knowledge of God in today's world and in our time. And this is really a problem because many do not even believe and many worship false gods. They worship something, whether it is themselves, whether it is money, whether it is television, whether it is their vacation resorts or whatever it is, they are worshiping something. Um, but a lot of times it is not the one true God. Unfortunately, the schools and colleges for quite some time have not been teaching accurate history, and they've removed God from the schools, which is so wrong. And the newer generations are not even aware of the mistakes made in the past in history because they are not learning it and therefore are unaware of how to avoid repeating the same mistakes. And we need to turn that around and teach truth. One of the things that God told B'nai Israel, you know, and this was, we talked about this at the, in the final book of the Torah, that if they kept his commandments, they would be blessed. That he would give the rain in the land in due season, the first rain and the latter rain, and that they could gather the corn, the wine, the oil, and they would, that he would send the grass in the field for the cattle, that they might eat and be full. And he warned them to take heed that their heart not be deceived and turn away from him and serve other gods and worship them, because then Adonai's wrath would be kindled against them, and he would shut up heaven, and there would be no rain, and then the land would yield no fruit, and they would perish quickly off the good land which Adonai gave to them. So there's blessings and curses that were discussed back in Deuteronomy. So much of the things still apply to today. During this time, it still applies. So, we need to serve the one true God. And he does give blessings to those of us that do believe in him and do trust in him and follow what he, to the best that we can, and follow his commandments. Um, so that is um, a little backtracking on what we've already discussed, but it continues again into this book. As you see that B'nai Israel doesn't take heed to what was passed on to them, because it probably wasn't passed on to them at all. It got lost in translation, and they fell prey to what was going on around them. And there was a lot of pagan worship going on, because the inhabitants that were not driven out of the land, that's what they worshiped, was false gods and idols. And when we think about present day applications, it is very important to our lives, as born again and saved, that we must be careful to not fall away and be led by the ways of the world. We need to strive to follow what God wants for us to do, and not the ways of the world and what the world wants us to do. Because in the end, what the world wants us to do naturally sometimes leads us into apostasy and falling away and sin. And the commandments of not committing idolatry apply to today, as well as loving and serving Adonai with all of our heart, soul, and might, and keeping his commandments. We need to not fall into unbelief and trust in Adonai as he leads and guides our lives. So I'm laying a foundation here before we actually talk about the very first judge. So as we open up, the beginning of this book opens with Joshua being gone and Israel going through a vicious cycle of ups and downs, because they did, they did what was right in their own sight. And this is clearly what is going on in our world today, and not what was right in God's sight. Nations may appear to get away with sin a long time, but God will eventually show them the error of their ways. So, chapter 1 deals with the Canaanite strongholds. Even today, the Canaanites do not want to give Israel their land and what is rightfully theirs. Chapter 1 of Judges begins after the death of Joshua. B'nai Israel asked the Lord who would go up against the Canaanites first to fight against them. And the Lord said that Judah shall go. And then Judah had asked Simeon to go. And as you could see, when they went up into their land, and we had just read this, I'm not going to reread all of this again, how they drove out a good part of the land, but they didn't drive them all out. And there was a remnant that was there. And then Caleb also had given Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, Aksa, his daughter, if he would smite Kiriath Sepher, and he did. So then Aksa asked for the springs, and the upper springs were given, as we have read earlier. The remainder of chapter 1 shows that the land that was conquered and everything that belonged to Israel. However, again, Judah could not drive out all of the inhabitants because they had chariots of iron. Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses said that he would, because he expelled 3 sons of Anak, the giants. And the problems came as Israel, to the children of Israel, because they did not drive out all the inhabitants from the land as God commanded, and which is what we're talking about. And they would become a thorn in their side. And again, then we went through each of the tribes and how they took on their land, but they always left this remnant that they couldn't seem to get rid of. And again, they would be left with issues as well from each of the tribes it goes through. So then chapter 2 shows how these heathen nations did indeed become a thorn in the sides of Benaiah Israel. And the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and spoke about all that God had done for them and delivering them out of bondage from Egypt to the present time, reminded them that He's faithful and will never break His covenant with them. But He told them that they were not to make league with the inhabitants of this land, but they were to throw down their altars. But He told them that they had not obeyed this, and that because they had not obeyed and driven them completely out of their land, He was not going to drive the remainder of them out either, but they would become thorns in their side. So Benaiah Israel lifted up their voice and wept at this, and they called, then the place was called Bochim, and they sacrificed unto Adonai. Now, this had occurred actually when Joshua was still alive, and he let the people go. They each went to their inheritance, their land, and the people served Adonai all the days of Joshua. Now, Joshua lived again 110 years. And again, what we're going to proceed with is after Joshua and after the elders had passed on, and we've got new generations who do not know Adonai and what He has done for them, and the Benaiah Israel kept vacillating between falling away, apostasy, and repentance. So we're going to continue now with chapter 3. Now, these are the nations that Adonai left to test all Israel who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan. It was only in order that the generation of Benaiah Israel might learn from war which they had not experienced before. These nations included the 5 Philistine lords and all the Canaanites, Zidonians, and Hivites living in the hill country of Lebanon from Mount Baal Hermon to the entrance of Hamath. They were for testing Israel to know whether they would obey the mitzvot of Adonai, which He had commanded their fathers by Moses' hand. But getting tongue-tied here. But Benaiah Israel settled among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and they took their daughters for them as wives, gave their own daughters to their sons, and worshipped their gods. Benaiah Israel did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, forgot Adonai their God, and worshipped the Baalim and the Asherahs. So Adonai's anger burned against Israel, and He sold them over into the hand of King Hushan Rishatham. That's a name. I'm going to spell that for you. Capital CUSHAN hyphen RISHATHAIM of Aram Naharam. And Benaiah Israel served Cushan Rishatham for 8 years. So now we're going to talk about the first judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. When Benaiah Israel cried out to Adonai, Adonai raised up a deliverer for Benaiah Israel to deliver them, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger kinsman. The Spirit of Adonai came upon him as he judged Israel. When he went out to war, Adonai gave King Cushan Rishatham of Aram into his hand so that he had the upper hand over Cushan Rishatham. Then the land had peace for 40 years. When Othniel son of Kenaz died, Benaiah Israel did what was evil in Adonai's eyes, so Adonai strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel because they had done evil in Adonai's eyes. So he gathered to himself the people of Ammon and Amalek. Then went and defeated Israel and took possession of the city of palms. Benaiah Israel became subject to King Eglon of Moab for 18 years. So when Benaiah Israel cried out to Adonai, Adonai raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. Now Benaiah Israel sent tribute with him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made himself a double-edged sword, a cubit in length, which he girded on his right thigh under his cloak. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Eglon was a very fat man. Now when Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he dismissed the people who had carried the tribute, but he himself turned back at the idols that were near Gilgal and said, I had a secret message for you, O king. Keep silence, he replied. So all his attendants left him. Then Ehud approached him while he was sitting alone in a roof chamber where it was cool and said, I have a message from God for you. So he arose from his throne. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. Even the handle went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not withdraw the sword out of his belly, and the filth came out. Then Ehud went out by the porch, shut the doors of the roof chamber on him, and locked them. After he had gone out, his courtiers came and looked, but behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. So they said, he is only relieving himself in the cool chamber. So they waited till they were embarrassed, but behold, he still did not open the doors of the roof chamber. So they took the key and opened them, and behold, their master was lying dead on the floor. But Ehud escaped while they were lingering, passed beyond the idols, and escaped to Seirah, Seirah. When he arrived, he blew the shofar in the hill country of Ephraim. So Benaiah Israel went down with him from the hill country, and he was in front of them. He said to them, Follow me, for Adonai has delivered your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab, and allowed no one to cross over. They then they struck down at that time about 10,000 men of Moab, all stout men of valor, not a man escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel. Then the land had peace for 80 years. After him came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistine men with an ox goad. So he delivered Israel. So we have our first three judges, Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. Interesting stories. Othniel was raised up to leadership as a judge. Othniel was Caleb's nephew, who married Caleb's daughter, Aksa. And God wanted to prove Israel to be sure. They carved out his instructions. So we have Othniel and we have Ehud, who actually took the king of Moab out, Eglon, and there was peace then for Israel after 18 years of being servants to Moab. And to just back up, when Othniel was a judge, he had brought peace to Israel for 40 years. So they had been, then they again fell away and had 18 years of servitude to King Eglon of Moab, and then they were given 80 years of peace in the land. And then the last judge in chapter 3, we have Shamgar. So I am going to pause it now, and we're going to come back with chapter 4, which is an exciting story of Deborah. And Barak. So we're going to talk about Deborah and Barak and Jabin, who's another character, and Jael. Actually, Jael is you're going to find out who she is. These are some interesting stories in the book of Judges that we're going to actually go over. So anyway, we are going to come back with a part 4.